Hey guys, welcome back to more crazy teacher stories. In this video, a Karen teacher threw away my kid's medication, claiming that he just pretends to be sick. Here is what happened. And the first one starts like this. So every morning I walk my dog at the off-lead dog park. By the way, is it off-lead or off-leash? I'm always confused by this. Anyway, as it's a small town, all the dog walkers have become friendly. I, mid-40s, made friends with June, 75 to 80. June told me this lovely MC story from about 25 years ago or more. June was working as a school teacher and was retraining as a social worker. She left teaching for 2 years working as a social worker when her previous school asked her and run a class for at-risk children. The deal was she would teach children aged 12 to 18, grade 7 to 12, who come from backgrounds of emotional, physical, and even sexual abuse. The job was causal, so she didn't get paid for holidays, sick leave, etc. She was just supposed to teach 6 kids with an aide, but ending up with 20 kids and no teacher aide. As you can imagine, their behavior was terrible. She believed she could help, and she said she did make some differences. The work was really stressful, but she was passionate about it. After 3 years and multiple promises of making her a permanent staff member, getting an aide plus smaller classes, June was burnt out. She demanded help from the principal, who refused and told her, since she has complained, it is for the last time, and then sacked her. He told her she is casual and she go complain to everyone and everywhere, but as a casual worker you have little rights. So June did complain to everyone, school inspector, the union, Department of Education, it was a state school, and even her local member of parliament, who told her that she has had a tough deal, but this is the life of a casual worker. She finally complained to the state authority that deals with safe work practices. They were interested as the school has breached state policy on class sizes for special needs kids, teacher aides providing a safe environment, etc. They ordered the Department of Education to pay her workers compensation while they sorted it out. So now June was paid each fortnight, including leave and all benefits, 52 weeks a year instead of 40. The fallout was big after the investigation. Lots of people sacked or moved on. What this did was leave June without a boss. The Safe Work Practice Department closes the case as they believe it was now a Department of Education matter to pay June out. Everyone had forgotten about June and she got lost in government paperwork. They still paid her and she kept quiet. It took 10 years before they found her in an employee audit. Then they paid her out. June was ready to retire about then, so it worked out beautifully. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I gotta say, that is a very impressive story. This woman really knows how to conduct herself. Anyway, the next one is the title story and is titled, Karen Teacher Threw Away My Kid's Medication. I am tired of dealing with the horribly ignorant assumption that epilepsy only presents in body spasming, attention grabbing, and absolutely unmistakable seizures. That a child is only seizing if they fall to the ground and thrash around with all their limbs. The reason I'm tired of dealing with this is because of something that is demonstrated in this story. Seizures have an entire spectrum of different ways that seizures can look like. The person suffering from epilepsy can also either have plenty of warning for their seizures or just crash out of normal consciousness in moments. My son was lucky enough to be one of the former for the most part. Even at the relatively young age of 10, my son, I'll call him Timmy, had been suffering from epilepsy for quite a few years. He was taking daily medication that made it to where he had just few seizures, if any, by the time this story happened. When he did have symptoms, he would have plenty of minor symptoms, often called auras, like tingling in his limbs and strange flavors and smells that sprung out of nowhere. My son was starting middle school and was very responsible, especially when it came to his medications. I taught him to respect them for exactly the danger they could present if used irresponsibly. Even while trusting him, I was aware of the chance that a 10-year-old makes a mistake, so I take my precautions. So then I sent him everywhere with 1 dose of his rescue therapy medication, and I have it in a box that is locked. A copy of the prescription was in the box and had already been provided to the school administration. This leads up to the day of the story that you are all here for. We will call his homeroom teacher Mrs. Johnson. My son was in class when he felt the tingling run through his limbs and smelled the strange smells I mentioned before. He went straight for the emergency dose to take care of the seizure immediately. He said that the symptoms got severe quickly, so he was a bit panicky and drew some attention. Mrs. Johnson was the key attention he grabbed. It became obvious that it wasn't the common kid picking a snack out of his backpack, so she came over and nabbed the pill from Timmy right when he got it out of the lockbox. She yelled, "What do you think you're doing with this? These are not for young children. Did you get this from your parents?" Timmy said, "Yes, it's for my epilepsy. I need it or I'm going to have a seizure." Mrs. Johnson had the audacity to reply, "Oh, I don't know where you would have heard such a thing, but you're a tough young lad, and you don't need something like this." She waved the baggie around and Timmy said, "The prescription for my name is in that bag. I need to take it soon, Mrs. Johnson." Mrs. Johnson said, "You're still young, sweetie. Don't worry so much and I know you'll be okay. You don't need to pretend to be sick." She walked away from him with his medication and would not hear any more of his complaints. Timmy was also feeling the symptoms worsen and asked one more time for her to please give him his pill. She responded by leaving the classroom for a moment to throw the pill in a trash can that "you children won't be able to get into." My son felt the symptoms worsening, so he took a seat and settled into a stable position. He most often has what I usually call tonic seizures, which result in a stiffening of all your muscles. This instance was, fortunately for both Timmy and Miss Johnson, one of these tonic seizures. I say fortunately, but it still resulted in my son feeling little and helpless in the middle of a bunch of students while all his muscles froze up and he even lost consciousness for a short time. I have been with my son many times during his seizures and it's often terrifying for him even when he has his mother there supporting him. When he is alone and ostracized by an ignorant teacher like Mrs. Johnson, I cannot imagine how much worse this must feel for him. As soon as control of his body was returned to him, Timmy burst into tears. Mrs. Johnson acted all sympathetic, but was still unwilling to do much more than tell my boy to just suck it up. Timmy could tell enough had gone wrong because of Mrs. Johnson's lack of respect for him, so he just waited for the homeroom period to be over to walk straight to the principal's office. He asked to call me and was crying when he told me about his seizure and asked if he had to stay in school for the rest of the day. I have not always taken him home from school for seizures in the past, but in this case, I knew that I needed to. I went to the school, but I wasn't okay with just taking my kid and leaving. I went to the classroom before going to the principal's office and asked the teacher to retrieve my son's medication from the trash can and apologized to Timmy for her disrespect and actions. She refused and mocked me for being an inattentive parent who cannot even try to take care of my kid beyond just shoveling pills down his throat. I decided that following my first urge to smack the woman across the face was probably not the smartest maneuver. So I went to the principal's office and collected my son and the assistant principal. Together we all went and spoke to Mrs. Johnson, and she ended up digging through the contents of that trash can to find my son's medication. The assistant principal said that it would be difficult to have Timmy's homeroom changed immediately, but he could offer Timmy a free pass to his office anytime it was needed. The incident fell into the past and Timmy was not having any more seizures. Mrs. Johnson was a horrible woman, but Timmy was brave and willing to make it through the homeroom hours with her day by day. I thought that he could make it through one lousy school year with her, as it seemed the assistant principal must have forgotten it or just not felt the situation was urgent. When it came time for parent-teacher conferences, I spoke to all of Timmy's teachers and heard great glowing endorsements of him from every single one. Then I went and sat down to speak with Mrs. Johnson. Except she was not interested in talking about Timmy. I sat across from her and she said, "You must have thought you had everyone fooled, but not me. Never me." I replied, "What could you possibly mean by that?" "Oh, my son has epilepsy and is in bad need of his medication or the seizures could badly hurt him. Oh, I'm doing the best thing to take care of my son by shoveling chemicals into his young healthy body." Mrs. Johnson, I have an undoubtable diagnosis and have worked with many doctors on exactly what is best for my child, and I will not allow your opinions to sway me. Mrs. Johnson leaned in close to me and quietly said, "F you and your new age BS. We used to know how to parent back in the day, all these supposed chronic diseases, but I didn't see your son so much as twitch in a way that was abnormal that day. Back then we knew how to rub some dirt on it and our kids made it through just fine." I replied, "Mrs. Johnson, it's not your place to tell me how to raise my child. You are here to help care for my child, true, but I went through all the procedures necessary to authorize my child to have that pill on his person. I don't care about some lousy paperwork when the whole idea of it is unnecessary. If your kid is not thrashing and is still able to breathe, then I don't understand why you choose to put crap in his body instead of giving him the attention he obviously feels that he needs. You don't care about paperwork? Of course, I don't care about your stupid paperwork. It doesn't change the facts of the matter. The whole situation was made worse by the way she crumpled up her lip with disgust anytime she cursed. It made her look like a human-sized rat. That could not steal the elation that filled me when I realized that this was all perfect to get on recording. Like my son before me, I left Mrs. Johnson behind at the scheduled time and went straight to the assistant principal. When I showed him the recording I had, audio recording, and said that I was going to file a formal complaint with the board, he was profuse with apologies for not having fulfilled my transfer request sooner. I accepted his apology and I truly am not upset with him. A greater good came out of Timmy staying in the class for a bit longer. When I went to the board, it didn't take long before Mrs. Johnson was fired from the school. I even raised it to the State Board of Education, and her license was put on probation in the state that we live in, so she was not authorized to do anything more than substitute teaching without further review. I'm not even mad at her insults about me and my parenting. The idea though that she thought that children are not tough because they have and take precautions for their chronic conditions is what I thought was disgusting. Someone like that should never be in a position of authority and influence over children. And yeah, ripe stars, honestly, that teacher was absolutely disgusting. I would not wish to have such a teacher even on my worst enemy. Anyway, the next one is a neighbor petty revenge story and it's absolutely amazing. This was years ago actually, decades ago. I was 25 years old when I was able to buy my first house. It meant a lot to me. I was just a laborer and it took everything I had to pay rent, eat cheap and save for the down payment. And by the way guys, who are these people that can buy a house at 25 years old? That is absolutely unfathomable in the 21st century. Anyway, I didn't come from money nor was I afforded any type of generational wealth. I had to get a conventional loan which had a higher interest rate, plus the house had to meet certain requirements in order for the home to qualify for the loan. That means an inspector had to check the property and make an assessment. I met the inspector at the house. I was renting a home just one street over. The inspector showed me the list of things the homeowner had to fix. Two of the biggest were all electrical outlets needed to have dielectric grease on the connectors. The house had aluminum wire, not copper, long story longer, that helps prevent electrical fires. The other big thing was the soil around the house had to slope away from the foundation. I knew the sellers were not gonna fix any of that stuff and someone else could afford to buy via cash or a different loan mechanism. I asked the homeowner if I could fix those items myself. They had no issues. I spent the next 3 days working non-stop doing exactly what needed to be done. On a Monday, the inspector came out and said the ground sloping away was not good enough. I was there with him and told him I did the best I could and I was the person buying the home and I would do exactly what he wanted, but I first needed to secure the purchase. He looked at everything on the list and the dirt was the only item that was of issue. He must have took pity on me because I got the loan and stated to move in. The first issue I had was a neighbor across the street and 2 homes over kept parking in my driveway. Every time I came with a truck, he had his car parked in my driveway. I did not even know who owned the car. I started to knock on doors. One neighbor pointed me to the guy's house. He would not come to the door. I just as politely as possible yelling through the door that I need him to move his car because I'm moving in. After 10 minutes, nothing, so I went back and very politely told him his car was now on a tow truck and I was giving him the tow truck company's card on his porch. It was amazing how fast he got to the door then. He opened the door and ran past me only to see his car still parked in my driveway. He turned around and said, "You lied!" I said his car will be towed in about 10 minutes by the company I worked for called Toe Jam. Probably from Toe Jam and Earl. He moved his car right then, and by the way, I did not work for a tow company, but it didn't matter. I believe it was a deterrent for him to believe it. Was it petty? I believe so. The next petty thing that took place was between myself and my next door neighbor. So our driveways were next to each other with a strip of yard that separates the drives as well as the properties. He had a young teenage son that was always working on his POS in their driveway. One day the kid drives off of his driveway and through my yard and out of my driveway. To be honest, I was a little ticked off. A little later he returns home and again drives to my driveway across my yard onto his driveway. I walk up to their front door, knock, and when the door opens I'm greeted with the teenager saying, "What?" I ask to speak with his dad or mom. He then shuts the door and I don't hear anything. I walk back over to my home, get a lawn chair and sit on their porch. Every 10 minutes I knock on the door. Finally the kid says they are not home. I said I'll wait. Another 5 minutes goes by and the dad finally steps out. He is just as creep as his kid. I tell him what took place and said I don't want it to happen again and actions have consequences. Well, it happened again and now I'm really ticked off. I go and pull up a couple of dead rose bushes and plant them at the corner of my driveway, go and knock on the door, and when the father figure appears, I walked him out and showed him my beautiful dead rose bushes. He noted that the bushes were dead. I asked him if that was his first house and he said no. I said this is my first home and I needed him to respect that. That the rose bushes were a symbol that I could very easily plant spikes that would puncture tires, not thorns, on a beautiful brown rose bush. He looked at me, nodded and went back inside. I heard yelling and from then on his kid did not mess with my property. I wanna add that I've been petty my entire life. Countless amounts of planning and being eaten up with these types of silliness. After a lot of therapy, I can finally say I'm a lovable, well-adjusted, petty MFer. And now let's move on to the next story. It starts like this. I could be considered lucky because growing up I got to see the best of both a rural life and a more urban one. When I was around 4 years old, my parents got divorced and I stayed living in the city with my mother. My father decided to move back to where he grew up and help my grandfather run his farm. Whenever it was a weekend or holiday that I spent with my dad, I would always enjoy seeing the farm and running around to explore. I was more used to the city life, so having big open fields and tons of animals around was amazing. My grandfather was an incredible man too and always took time away when I would visit to spend with me. Running a farm is kind of a 24/7 job, so looking back and realizing how much time he gave to hanging out with me was sweet. He taught me how to do a lot of things on the farm, like riding horses, milking cows and how plants grew. A few times I even spent the entire summer helping on the farm and enjoying the slower paced area. Now, my dad passed away when I was 11, but that was not the end of me visiting the farm. My grandpa took over as the main male role model in my life. I would still spend weekends and some holidays with him well into my late teenage years and my early 20s. Of course, when I went off to college and started a life of my own, I was spread thinner and visited a lot less. I got a job in my own apartment in the city, so visits turned to phone calls for the most part. One day my mother called me crying to tell me that my grandfather had passed away. Despite being the father of her ex-husband, my mother was also close to him. It was devastating for all of us and I made sure to take the time off for his funeral. I did not know how many people in that small town knew and loved him until I saw them all at that day to mourn him. It felt comforting in a way to know that even when I was not around, he was surrounded by other people that cared about him. I also found out that my grandfather had a will and he had left me the farm in it. I was his only grandchild, but I was still amazed that he put the farm in my name. I had to make a decision if I was gonna choose to stay in the city or fully move out and run a farm. It was hard because I really do like both of the environments. At the end, I picked to take over the farm and keep it in the family for as long as possible. I was not able to move out with the snap of my fingers or anything. I still had to finish my apartment lease and properly quit my job. My grandfather had farm hands that started helping him take care of things in his older years. I kept them on for the time being and occasionally checked in on the farm to pay them for their work. I was finally out of my lease and could move to the farm fully, but was totally blindsided by this homeowner association. Despite being a rural area, there was an HOA that I did not know that much about. My grandpa complained about them a lot, but he complained about many things, to be honest. I always assumed the HOA was just one of those things that I didn't actually have to pay attention to them. I was making sure that the HOA dues were paid because I've been around the internet long enough to know that not doing so could start a huge fight. However, who knew that they were going to be the ones to actually start a fight with me? About a week or so before I was gonna move in, I got a call from the guys that take care of the farm for me. According to them, they could not get to the barn or fields anymore because I must have forgotten to give or leave them a key for the fence gate. Since there was not a fence or a gate before, and I'm sure I didn't have one put in without remembering, I was deeply confused. I asked them to send me a picture of what they were talking about since I really couldn't believe it. The picture came through and there was really a fence around my farm and the only way in was unlocking a large gate. I called the HOA because honestly I didn't know what else to do. It did not seem like a matter for the police at the moment. I figured that I paid the HOA anyway, so I might as well get something from them. One of the men actually used the truck to jump over the fence so he could at very least feed the animals. However, he could not let anybody else in though, because it was a padlock type of thing, so a key was needed no matter what side they were on. Anyway, I called the HOA, and after being put on hold for what felt like a way too long, I got through to somebody. HOA, hello? Me, hi, I'm calling about the farm at XYZ address. My workers called saying that they couldn't get in because somebody put a fence around it. HOA, and, well, I didn't put a fence around it. Somebody is blocking me from entering my property and I want to know if there's something you can do to help. HOA, what did you say your name was again? Me, it's OP. HOA, we know who owns property around here and you clearly don't. I tried to explain that the property belonged to my grandfather who died and it was left to me, so maybe their records of who owned it were not updated yet or something. Still, they were adamant about me not owning the property, and after going back and forth for 10 minutes, they hit me with this. HOA, sir, that property belongs to the HOA and no one else. We were the ones that put the fence around it, and I can have you arrested for admitting that you were the one trespassing on it. If you try to enter this property or have anybody else enter it again, I'm gonna make sure that you end up in jail. The person hung up on me and I was both furious and dazed. I never had a conversation like that in my life before and felt like I must have been dreaming. I knew that I was gonna have to fight them about this entire thing. They were claiming the farm belonged to them and I had no course of action against them except for suing them. Again, I've been around the internet long enough to know that the only thing to do when the HOA was going after you was to sue them and fight them in court. My biggest issue was that lawsuits take a long time, and while I didn't have any qualms about waiting for things to get sorted out, the animals did. I had to make sure that while all of this was going on, at least somebody was allowed onto the property to take care of the animals. When I called my lawyer, I made it very clear that the fence they had created stopped anybody from caring for the animals. He told me that while he would try to talk to a judge as soon as the lawsuit was filed, it might still take some time. The best course of action was to talk to the head of police and explain the situation. He had to, of course, get the head of the HOA involved in order to find an immediate solution for the animals while the courts did its slow process. The only downside was that the HOA had got some advance notice about being sued, but the animals were more important, of course. After a ton of fighting and them claiming the barn was empty and no animals existed, we came to an agreement. The police insisted they be allowed to check the property to see if animals were currently residing on the farm, which they were on. Then he gave the homeowner association two options. They could agree to have the animals relocated until the courts along with the farm confirmed ownership. Or they could allow a third party access to the property for the sole purpose of taking care of them. And I was willing to pay for that since I already was and I knew they were mine. They then agreed to the second option and one of the farmhands was given the key with instructions not to give it to me and not to do anything except take care of the animals. About a week later, the judge decided that because animals were involved, he would make an order before any kind of hearing or trial. That a new lock be put on the fence and the farmhand given the key. Neither side could use or enter the property until a final ruling was made. So I was still stuck living in the city and communicating from there while the HOA had a front row seat. Still, I was planning on destroying them and making sure I got my farm back. It took a while, but we finally had a meeting where we were both with our lawyers in a room and there were some other people in the room as well. I don't know exactly all of their specific roles, but I guess they made it official. My lawyer was upfront and stated that I owned the property and the HOA should immediately back off. If they did, I was willing to forego any further legal action on the matter. Basically, if they gave up right then and there, I would have dropped everything on my end. However, they refused to come to any agreement that wasn't me just letting them have the farm. If you wonder why the will and the deed were not enough, it was because the HOA had their own fake paperwork. They claim that when my grandfather was alive, he signed papers that state that the property would not be inherited to anyone and so he would donate the land to the HOA after his death since they owned it before he did. This was an outright lie since I believe his father owned the property before him. I had no proof on that though, so we didn't really try and argue against that too hard as our legal plan. Either way, they were claiming that the will was fake or that their paperwork was more valid or something. They wanted to take it all the way to court, which meant more waiting. Keep in mind that I already quit my job and gave up the lease on my apartment, so I was back living with my mom and not working. instead of just doing research on these laws and working on my case until it seemed unbeatable. When we went to court, the lawyers did most of the talking and I was just asked a few simple questions, confirming who I was and that I did not touch or alter my grandfather's will. All of the boring stuff that I had answered for people about 1,000 times at this point. The head of the HOA then started talking about how the HOA being donated land was an essential and vital part of the neighborhood. That my grandfather was a great man and would have loved to do that for his community. So then they could use the land to build structures that would help everybody as a whole, trying to mark me as some greedy city guy instead of a person that spent half his time growing up on that very same farm. Now the HOA lawyers must have spent most of their time trying to prove that the paperwork they had was not forged. And that my grandfather leaving it to them on a certain date meant that it overrode whatever he put in the actual will. They even told the court that they were willing to make amends by letting me keep a small portion of the land. My lawyer and I were not even trying to argue if their paperwork was or was not forged. Instead, we were arguing that it was not even legal to begin with. My lawyer pulled up a list of properties that when digging are owned by the HOA. All of those gotten by using the same kind of forms that they claimed my grandfather signed. Each one of those properties was not paying any kind of tax because it was being used as a home. It was being used as a community space, and yet each and every property was getting mail delivered to in the names of different HOA board members. Going to the properties would reveal a house that was clearly being lived in. On top of that, no other property existed in the names of any HOA members. They all had a PO box instead of an actual address. They were using this method of stealing properties in order to live and avoid paying certain taxes because of it. According to their taxes and government records, they did not have a home, so how could they be expected to pay anything on them? Well, legally they did have addresses, but it was all for homes that elderly relatives lived in and that they were clearly just pretending to be staying at. The entire case got a lot more interesting once that piece of information had been opened up. For a long time we were trying to find something solid about the documents themselves being illegal or not valid. Donating land, though, is something people can do, and going down that route did not get us anywhere. So instead we were claiming that the forms were indeed all fake and they were forging them in order to live on a property while claiming it was community space. It also did not help them that many members of the community claimed that my grandfather spoke badly of the HOA in public. Also talked about me all the time and how he knew that once he passed away, I would look after the farm. The controversy mixed with the testimony was enough for a judge to agree that what he wrote in his will was valid and the paperwork the HOA had was forged. Of course, that was not the end of what happened to them though. What I was doing was a civil case, but now that they had basically been caught doing fraud on a federal level, they were getting arrested. Then they were going to criminal court and through that entire process. My part was done though, and the judge ordered the fence to be removed fully and I be allowed to finally move into my family farm. I was relieved that the entire thing was over and I could start this new chapter in my life. The one where I get to make my grandfather proud and all of that good stuff. I would say one thing for sure, I was glad to be able to see the animals again. Some of the cows and horses I have known for years and had bonds with. Being in the town also meant that I had a front row seat to hear everything that was gonna happen with the HOA. The board members all confessed to living in the homes while claiming otherwise, and they also admitted to at least some of the paperwork being forged and the next of kin not even attempting to be contacted. They were clearly targeting people they didn't think had family and might not even have a will. I was not around enough for them to notice, I guess, and assumed my grandfather had nobody. They all went to jail and the next of kin for the properties were all contacted. They had the option to sell the properties or let it be properly donated. Since they heard about what happened, most of them were too worried about history repeating itself if they donated the land. Some really did have no next of kin and the brand new HOA was responsible for the land. This one was made up of better people, or more scared ones, and they used the property for what it was meant for and built a community center for people, as well as an area where people could sell goods like a small farmer's market. I'm glad that I agreed to take the property because if I didn't, I hate to think what the corrupt HOA would have done with it. And yeah, Ripe Stars, I am glad that OP came out on top of it in the end and that the evil HOA members finally ended up behind bars. That is exactly where entitled evil HOA douchebags belong if you ask me. Either way guys, I was thinking while reading this story and all the other farm HOA stories as well, that I really need to replay either Harvest Moon or Stardew Valley, which is one of my favorite games. Have you ever played any of these farming games? And if you did, which one is your favorite? Let me know in the comments, and while you're at it, please don't forget to like the video and maybe even post a comment if you want to support me. And the next one is titled "The Neighbor Went Too Far." I live in an apartment complex and the parking lot has a terrible entrance. In order to exit the parking lot, you have to traverse a small tunnel about 4 to 5 meters long, and a car is barely able to pass through the tunnel. A tow truck definitely can't. A couple of days ago, my neighbor came to knock at my door. I barely know him, but he seemed like a kind person the few times I talked to him. He told me his car was broken and asked if I could help him bring it to the other side of the tunnel so that a tow truck could come and pick it up. I said sure. My cousin was with me at the time, so he came to help too. We pushed the car until the end of the tunnel and left it on the side of the road in a point where the road gets larger. The neighbor thanked us and we parted ways. The next day his wife came to knock at my door. She initially thanked us for helping her husband, but then she started scolding us when she found out that we left her husband alone. Apparently the man suffered a heart stroke a few weeks ago and he is not supposed to be left alone for prolonged periods of time. I did not know this, of course. He looked like a healthy man in his late 40s and he said nothing to us. We explained this to her and she said that even if we didn't know that, we should have stayed with him. What if the tow truck had problems picking up the car? What if he had to move the car again? I tried discussing with her for a few minutes, but to be sincere, I had no strength to argue, so I simply said I was sorry and dropped the whole thing. Now I'm curious though. So Reddit, am I the jerk for leaving the man alone there and not waiting for the tow truck to arrive? And yeah, ripe stars, in my opinion, obviously OP is not the a-hole here, since he is not the babysitter of a 40-plus-year-old man. If this woman is so worried about her husband, why didn't she just stay with him then? Doesn't make any sense to me. Please let me know what you think about this in the comments. And someone on Reddit said, not the a-hole, you did not know and had no reason to assume this person didn't have access to a phone or help from other people. Comment number 2, not the a-hole, if he shouldn't be alone for long periods of time, then where was his wife? The guy had to come and knock on your door after all. And yeah, obviously I would 100% agree with Reddit here. There's no reason why OP would be the a-hole in this situation. And yeah guys, if you cannot get enough of my content, please don't forget to check out my podcast by searching for Ripe Stories on all major podcast platforms such as Spotify, Apple or Google Podcasts. Furthermore, you can find bonus content by going to patreon.com/ripeyoutube or by clicking the join button here on YouTube. For a small monthly fee, you will get access to dozens and dozens of exclusive videos you won't find anywhere else. Thank you so much for watching and I hope to see you again tomorrow.